My name is David Clark, and I was a sergeant in the 1st Cavalry Division, 3rd Brigade during the Vietnam War. I arrived in Vietnam in 1967, just barely 19 years old. I came from a small town in Texas, and to be honest, I didn't know much about the war when I first got drafted. They gave me a rifle and a uniform and shipped me off to the other side of the world. It was the first time I'd ever been away from home, and I didn't realize what I was getting into until I got there. We were stationed in the central highlands of Vietnam, an area known for its dense jungles and dangerous terrain. It was a place where you couldn't trust the ground beneath you, and every step was a gamble. I remember the humidity hitting me like a wall when I stepped off the plane. The air was thick with sweat, and the jungle was all around us. It felt like everything was alive, like even the trees and the grass were waiting for us to slip up. We weren't in a combat zone right away, but we knew it wouldn't take long. The tension in the air was thick from the start. We'd get briefed on the terrain and the enemy. The Viet Cong were everywhere. They knew the land like it was part of them. They wore those old sandals made from tire rubber, so you couldn't hear them coming unless you were looking right at them. We were given the standard M16 rifles, and I remember thinking about how light it was compared to the old bolt-action rifles my grandfather had told me about. But it felt like it couldn't possibly do what I needed it to. The first few weeks were full of training exercises. We went through the motions of jungle warfare, but the instructors were quick to remind us that nothing could prepare us for the real thing. I don't think anyone truly understood the horror of what was to come. They talked about ambushes, about being surrounded, and about the enemy using traps and tactics we couldn't even begin to imagine. It all sounded so far away, until it didn't. One of my earliest memories of combat happened about a month into my tour. We were out on a routine patrol near a small village on the edge of the jungle. The air was still, and the trees hung over us like a canopy of green. It felt like the world was holding its breath. We weren't expecting trouble. But that's the thing about Vietnam. Trouble always comes when you least expect it. I was walking point that day, meaning I was the guy leading the patrol, checking for booby traps and making sure we weren't walking into an ambush. My heart was pounding in my chest as I moved through the thick underbrush. The jungle smelled like wet earth and decay, but it was also strangely beautiful in a way. It was hard to focus on that though when every sense was on high alert. Every step could be the last one. Suddenly, there was a rustling noise to my left. My head snapped over in that direction and I froze. My hand immediately went to the M16 hanging by my side. My finger hovered over the trigger, but I didn't fire. It was probably just an animal, a monkey, maybe, but in that moment I couldn't be sure. Everything in the jungle had the potential to be deadly, from the smallest insect to the enemy hiding in the brush. I motioned for the others to stop and listen. We stood there in the thick silence of the jungle for what felt like forever. But there was nothing. After a few moments, I motioned for the team to move forward. We kept walking, but my senses were on edge. Something didn't feel right, but I couldn't place it. We moved deeper into the jungle, and that's when it happened. The first shot rang out. It was like time slowed down for a moment. The sound was deafening. It came from somewhere ahead of us, and before I knew it, there was another shot, then another. The sound of gunfire filled the air like a thunderstorm. I dove behind a tree, and the rest of the team scrambled to find cover. My heart was hammering, and adrenaline flooded my veins. The M16 felt heavier than ever, but my training kicked in. I looked to my left and saw one of the other guys, Corporal Jacobs, duck behind a log. He was trying to stay calm, but I could see the fear in his eyes. I couldn't let him see me panic. We were all in this together. The jungle erupted around us, and I could hear the rustling of leaves and the snap of branches as the Viet Cong moved through the brush. They knew exactly where to aim. I could feel the tension in the air, as if it were a physical presence, tightening around my chest. Every inch of ground felt like it was slipping away from me. We returned fire, but it was difficult to tell where the enemy was. They were hidden, using the jungle's natural camouflage to their advantage. I glanced over at Jacobs, who was lying flat on the ground, trying to stay as low as possible. His rifle was shaking in his hands. I shouted for him to get his head down, but the roar of gunfire drowned out everything else. The firing continued, and we found ourselves pinned down. I try to keep my head down, but every now and then, I'd risk a glance over the log or behind a tree to try and spot where the shots were coming from. It was impossible. The Viet Cong knew this land. They knew how to move silently and strike without warning. They had the advantage, and we were just trying to survive. Time seemed to stretch out as the gunfire echoed through the trees. There was no way to tell how long we had been there, but it felt like hours. Sweat soaked through my uniform, and my hands were slick with it. I was running low on ammo, and I knew that if we didn't get reinforcements soon, we might not make it out of there. But there was no way to call for help. Our radios were useless in the dense jungle, and we were too far from the base to get any air support. Then, just when I thought we were done for, I heard the distinct sound of helicopters overhead. It wasn't a sound you'd ever forget. It was the sound of salvation. We didn't know if the choppers were ours or if they were the enemy trying to draw us out, but we didn't care. We just kept firing. I kept my rifle steady, trying to make every shot count. I felt like I was in some kind of nightmare, but there was no time to question what was real and what wasn't. I was fighting for my life and for the lives of the men with me. The choppers came closer, and the gunfire from the enemy began to die down. They were either retreating or trying to regroup for another assault. Either way, it didn't matter. The helicopters swooped in, and soon enough they were dropping off reinforcements. It felt like a miracle, like someone had thrown us a lifeline. The enemy scattered, and with the additional support, we managed to push them back. By the time the choppers left, the jungle had gone quiet once more. We were all alive, but shaken. We had just come face to face with death and somehow made it out. We didn't speak much after that. No one knew what to say. We had made it, and that was all that mattered. But as I sat there, trying to catch my breath, I realized something. The war wasn't just about fighting the enemy. It was about surviving. And we had survived. It was only after the helicopters left that I had a moment to really think about what happened. The jungle around us felt unnaturally quiet, almost too quiet. The gunfire had stopped, but it was still hard to shake the feeling that we were being watched. The kind of fear that settles into your bones and doesn't go away. The medic specialist Owens moved through the team, checking for injuries. A couple of guys had shrapnel wounds from some grenades the Viet Cong had thrown at us. Nothing life-threatening, but it was enough to remind us that things could have gone much worse. Owens gave us the basics, bandages, some painkillers, and moved on. There was no time for a full medical check. The mission wasn't over yet. We had to move out. The brass wouldn't let us rest for long. In fact, they were already making plans for our next operation. It wasn't long before we were back on patrol, deeper into enemy territory, looking for another fight. The reality of Vietnam hit me hard after that day. The war wasn't some distant thing you read about in the papers. It was a day-to-day grind, a struggle that was both physical and mental. But despite the constant threat of death, there were moments of camaraderie, moments where you'd forget the war for a second and just be a guy with a bunch of other guys trying to get through the day. That's what kept us going, I think. The bond between us. We were like brothers, whether we liked each other or not. In the heat of battle, you didn't question anyone's loyalty. You didn't have time. You just kept fighting. One night, we set up camp in a small clearing deep in the jungle. The temperature had dropped a little, and the humidity felt more tolerable, but we were all still drenched in sweat. There were no lights, just the soft glow of our campfire, the only thing that kept the dark at bay. We didn't speak much that night. We were all exhausted. I remember sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, thinking about home. I thought about the smell of the air back in Texas, about the sound of my mother's voice, and how far away it all felt. The war had a way of making everything seem distant. Even the memories of home felt like they were from someone else's life. I was pulled from my thoughts when I heard a noise. It was quiet, but unmistakable, the sound of someone moving through the jungle. My hand instinctively went to my rifle. I looked around. The other guys had already noticed too. We all froze, listening, waiting for something to give us a sign. But nothing happened. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure moving toward the edge of the camp. I couldn't see who it was at first. My heart was racing. It could have been anyone, one of our own, or an enemy scout. My finger hovered over the trigger, but I didn't fire. Not yet. Who's there? I called out in a low voice. There was no response, just more movement. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be stealthy. The crackling of the fire and the sounds of the jungle were louder than ever in that moment. I stood up slowly, still keeping my rifle aimed in the direction of the figure. Suddenly, there was a rustling sound, and before I could react, something or someone came charging at us. I swung my rifle toward the noise, but as it came into the light, I realized it wasn't an enemy soldier. It was one of our own, a private named Turner, one of the new guys. Turner was wild-eyed, his face covered in dirt and sweat. He was breathing hard, his uniform torn in places. It looked like he'd been running for miles. "Turner, what the hell?" I shouted, lowering my rifle. He didn't respond at first. He just stood there, looking like he'd seen a ghost. Then he spoke, his voice trembling. There was something out there. I don't know what. Something's following us." It didn't make sense. We hadn't seen any sign of the enemy for days, and the area was supposed to be clear. But the way Turner was acting, shaken, out of breath, it made me uneasy. I looked around at the guys. Some were on edge. Others looked confused. "Turner, calm down," I said, trying to steady my voice. "What do you mean? Something's following us?" He looked around the camp, his eyes darting back and forth like he was afraid someone, or something, was lurking just out of sight. "I don't know," he said, his voice shaking. "I heard it. It was in the trees. I don't know what it was, but I swear something was out there watching us." His words hung in the air, thick with fear. It was the kind of fear you couldn't fake. We all knew something wasn't right, but none of us could put our finger on it. The rest of the night passed without incident, but none of us slept easy. I don't know if Turner was imagining things or if there really was something out there. All I knew was that I didn't trust the jungle. It had a way of hiding things, of making you doubt your own senses. As I lay there, listening to the sounds of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that we were the prey, and the jungle was the hunter. The next morning, we packed up camp and moved out. Turner didn't say much, but I could tell he was still rattled. He kept looking over his shoulder as we walked, like he was expecting something to jump out of the jungle at him at any moment. The rest of us, though, tried to ignore it. We had our own jobs to do, our own fears to manage. But I'll admit, his story was sticking with me. The jungle was alive with the sounds of birds, insects, and the occasional rustle of leaves. The sun was already climbing higher, beating down on us with that sticky, oppressive heat. We marched in silence, the only noise being the crunch of boots on the dirt and the occasional shift of gear on our backs. Every now and then, I'd glance over at Turner, but he kept to himself. I couldn't tell if he was still afraid, or if he was just trying to focus on getting through the day. We had to cover a lot of ground that day, moving deeper into the jungle. We didn't know what we were looking for, but we knew we had to be ready for anything. It wasn't long before we came to a clearing that felt too quiet, too still. The air had a strange weight to it, like it was waiting for something to happen. I signaled for everyone to stop. Something didn't feel right. I had learned by then to trust my gut, even if I couldn't explain why. The jungle seemed to hold its breath, the usual sounds of wildlife gone silent. It was as though the whole world had paused, just waiting for something to snap. "Take cover," I whispered to the guys. We all scrambled into the trees, seeking shelter behind whatever we could find. I crouched down behind a thick log and pulled my rifle close, scanning the area. My pulse was racing, and I could feel the sweat trickling down my back, but I didn't dare move. The silence was almost suffocating. Then I heard it, a faint rustling. Not from the usual animals or the wind. It was too deliberate. My fingers tightened around my rifle. "Stay quiet," I said, barely above a whisper. We waited. The sound grew louder, closer. I could hear footsteps now, soft, measured steps moving through the underbrush. They weren't ours. I motioned for the guys to stay put, and I crawled forward just enough to get a better look. Through the dense trees, I saw movement. There was a shadow flitting between the trunks, low, quick, and unmistakably human. I couldn't tell if it was one of ours or the enemy, but we were about to find out. The rustling stopped. My heart skipped a beat. Then, in the blink of an eye, a figure emerged from the jungle. It was a Viet Cong soldier, crouching low and holding an AK-47. My instincts kicked in, and I squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, and the soldier dropped to the ground, motionless. It happened so fast. I don't even know if I had time to think. But the moment the soldier fell, everything erupted. A volley of gunfire came from all around us, and I dove back behind the log, my ears ringing. The jungle came alive with gunshots, shouts, and the sounds of men moving through the trees. I shouted for the team to return fire, and we all opened up. The M16s cracked through the air, but the enemy was fast, darting in and out of the jungle, using the trees and underbrush to stay hidden. We couldn't see them, but we could hear them, the sound of their footsteps, their rifles firing back at us. I could feel the weight of the battle bearing down on us. My hands were shaking, but I had to keep steady. Every shot counted. We were outnumbered, but we weren't going down without a fight. I took a deep breath, peered over the log, and fired. The recoil from the M16 was familiar now, like an old friend. But the gunfire from the enemy was relentless. I could hear Turner behind me, his voice a strained whisper. "They're all around us," he shouted, his panic rising. I turned just in time to see him break cover and charge toward the enemy's position, his rifle blazing. It was a mistake. He was out in the open. I yelled at him to stop, but it was too late. Turner dropped to the ground with a cry, his rifle skittering away from him. He wasn't moving. The jungle fell silent for a second, and my heart sank. I could see his legs, twisted at an awkward angle. He was down, and we couldn't afford to lose anyone. "Turner!" I shouted, my voice hoarse. But there was no time to go after him. The enemy was closing in fast. I had to make a choice, stay and fight, or risk everything to save him. I felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on me. I didn't want to lose anyone else. I made my decision. I called for Jacobs and Owens to cover me, and I sprinted out from behind the log, my rifle raised. The gunfire around me was deafening, but I didn't hear the bullets. All I could focus on was Turner. I reached him in seconds, dropped to my knees, and dragged him toward the cover of a nearby tree. He was barely conscious, but he was still alive. "Come on, Turner. Stay with me," I yelled, my hands shaking as I tried to stop the bleeding from his leg. His eyes fluttered open, and he whispered something, but it was too quiet to make out. I didn't have time to figure out what he said. I needed to get him back to the others. We were pinned down for what felt like hours, but eventually the enemy started to retreat. Reinforcements arrived, and the tide of the battle shifted in our favor. But by the time we had things under control, Turner was in bad shape. He was barely hanging on, and it was clear we couldn't stay much longer. We had no choice but to call in an evacuation. The choppers came, and we loaded Turner onto one of them, along with the rest of our wounded. As the helicopter lifted off, I watched the jungle below, wondering what we'd missed. It had all happened so fast, too fast for us to truly understand. Turner was going to make it, but I knew it wouldn't be the last time we'd see death in that jungle. We'd seen just a glimpse of it, and it was always lurking around the corner, ready to strike when we least expected it. But for now, we had survived, and that was enough. We didn't have much time to dwell on what had just happened. The chopper took Turner and the others to a field hospital, and the rest of us were left with the same grim task we had been given before. Keep moving. The war didn't wait for anyone. In Vietnam, with all its heat, danger, and endless jungle, certainly didn't care about our fear or our losses. We had a job to do. The days after Turner was evacuated were a blur. We moved through more of the jungle, setting up ambushes, raiding villages, and dealing with the constant threat of attack. But even with all the training we had, nothing could prepare you for the kind of war Vietnam was. It wasn't just about fighting the enemy. It was about surviving every second, every moment, and trying to hold on to something resembling sanity. I'll admit that I was starting to feel the weight of it all. After Turner went down, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were losing. One man here, another there. Guys who had been with me from the start, now scattered in the jungle, dead or wounded. It was getting harder to keep my head up, to push through another day of heat, sweat, and fear. It was one thing to face bullets. It was another to deal with the crushing exhaustion that came with being stuck in the jungle, fighting for your life day in and day out. The nights were the hardest. When the sun set and everything went dark, it was like the weight of the jungle pressed down on us even more. The sounds of the night, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, distant cries of animals, became unbearable, almost like they were mocking us. The silence in between those noises was the worst. It felt like the entire jungle was waiting for us to make a mistake. One night, we were on another routine patrol. It was just like the dozens of others we'd done before, but this time, something was different. The air felt heavier, thicker, and I could feel it in my bones. The men were all on edge, looking over their shoulders, checking the trees. We didn't talk much, just moving in single file through the jungle, scanning the ground for traps and listening for any signs of the enemy. I was walking near the back of the line that night, keeping an eye on the rear guard when I heard it, a soft, almost inaudible rustling in the trees above us. I froze, my hand instinctively going to my rifle. Everyone else stopped too. We all looked up, eyes wide. The sound was so faint it could have been an animal, but it could also have been something far worse. "Hold," I whispered to the group. The moment stretched on, and I felt like my heart was in my throat. Every single one of us was listening for a sound, trying to pinpoint where the danger was coming from. It felt like the jungle itself was closing in on us. Then a gunshot. It wasn't a distant shot. It was right there just ahead of us. The crack of the rifle was followed by the sickening sound of something hitting the ground. We didn't need to be told. The ambush was on. I dove for cover behind a large tree, and the rest of the men followed suit. Gunfire exploded around us as the Viet Cong opened up from hidden positions in the trees, their AK-47s spitting fire. The jungle erupted in chaos as we returned fire, but it was hard to aim. We couldn't see where they were coming from. All we had were the sounds of their shots and the rustling of leaves as they moved through the trees. I shouted for Jacobs and Owens to stay low, to find better cover, but the gunfire was intense. We were under heavy attack, surrounded on all sides. It felt like the whole jungle was full of enemy soldiers. I couldn't get a clear shot. I fired blindly into the trees, hoping I hit something, anything, then a loud explosion. The force of it knocked me off my feet, and I hit the ground hard. My head slammed into the dirt, and for a moment, everything went black. I could feel the ringing in my ears, and I struggled to push myself up. The world around me was spinning, but I managed to get my bearings. My rifle was still in my hands, but the blast had thrown me off. I was disoriented, and I had to get back in the fight. I looked around, trying to make sense of where I was. The jungle was a blur of green and brown, smoke curling into the air from the explosion. I could hear the shouts of my men, but they sounded distant, like they were coming from underwater. I tried to focus on the sound of gunfire, trying to get a sense of where the enemy was. Their movement to my left. I fired on instinct, and then I saw him. A Viet Cong soldier crouched behind a tree, aiming his rifle straight at me. I fired again, and the soldier dropped, his rifle clattering to the ground. But I didn't have time to celebrate. I had no idea how many more were out there. I crawled forward, closer to Jacobs and Owens, who had managed to get behind a large boulder. Jacobs was shouting, trying to make sense of the chaos, while Owens was working to tend to a wounded soldier. The fight felt like it was dragging on forever. We couldn't hold out much longer. The enemy had us outnumbered, and it felt like they were closing in. I ducked back down, trying to stay low, and that's when I saw something that made my stomach drop. Movement. Not in the trees, but on the ground, right in front of us. A string of claymore mines, set up in the brush, just a few yards away from where we were hiding. If we didn't move fast, we were going to be blown to pieces. "Move now!" I shouted, but no one had to be told twice. We scrambled, grabbing whatever we could and running for cover as fast as we could. The mines didn't go off, but I could feel the sweat running down my back, my heart pounding in my chest. We managed to pull back, heading for higher ground. But it wasn't over. The fight raged on, and it felt like we couldn't get out of it. Every time we thought we'd won a small victory, something else would pop up. It was a constant, relentless cycle. Hours later, when the enemy finally retreated, we were exhausted. I could barely stand, my legs were shaking, and my body ached from the adrenaline. But we were alive. We had survived another day. That night, as we set up camp, I thought about everything we'd been through. Turner, the ambushes, the explosions, it was all starting to blur together. But one thing stuck with me. The jungle was unforgiving. And so was the war. The rest of the mission felt like one long blur. We stayed alert, always expecting the next ambush, the next explosion, but somehow we kept moving forward. The jungle never gave us a break. After that night, things didn't slow down. Each day felt just like the last. Tense, exhausting, and always on edge. We lost a few more good men along the way, but we also gained something, maybe by accident. A certain numbness. We finally reached a small base camp, and for the first time in a while I thought we might catch a break. We were safe for the moment. The gunfire and explosions had faded into the distance. I sat on the ground that evening, staring into the campfire, wondering if I'd ever really feel like myself again. Everything had changed. We had all changed. The war took pieces of us, and what it didn't take, it buried deep inside. But there was one thing I knew for sure. We'd made it. That was the only thing that mattered. We kept fighting, kept surviving. And somehow, we found a way to keep each other going, even when everything else seemed to fall apart. And so, as I sat there, I thought about home, about the quiet of the world before the war. But in my heart, I knew that would never come back. Vietnam had marked us, and that was something we could never undo.